All right, so last time we ended talking about cortisol, and we said that cortisol levels were actually difficult to evaluate within studies. And this is because they have a cyclic rhythm or a cycle that they follow on the average daytime. And so they have high levels early in the morning, which taper off during the day, and then they raise up again in the middle of the night to early morning hour times. So this is actually a fluctuation that is typical within the body for many different types of hormones, and this is called a circadian rhythm. So what exactly is a circadian rhythm? Because this is actually going to take us into an understanding about, well, what I feel is actually what traditional Chinese medicine is predominantly based on. So circadian rhythms are any biological process that displays an endogenous, entrainable oscillation of about 24 hours. And so these are just some of the aspects in human life that are regulated in a circadian fashion. So for example, this would be starting at 6 in the morning. And if we move around here, we can see that the sharpest rise in blood pressure occurs at about 6:45. Melatonin secretion is going to stop about 7:30 in the morning. A bowel movement is most likely in the morning as well. The highest testosterone secretion, the highest cortisol secretion is going to be around this time as well. You have the highest alertness around 10 a.m., best coordination around 2:30, your fastest reaction time around 3:30, the greatest cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength around 5 p.m., highest blood pressure around 6:30, highest body temperature around 7, and then melatonin secretion starts around 9 p.m. So this is a daylight, nighttime controlled phenomenon. At about 10:30, bowel movements are suppressed, and your deepest sleep comes at about 2 a.m. Lowest body temperature about 4:30 in the morning. So this is just a nice diagram indicating many of the different factors that are being regulated in a very cyclical fashion within the body. So there's this harmony that goes on with the body based on the timing from our environment. So we get environmental cues, and our body evaluates these cues to actually make different changes. And our circadian rhythms, they don't only fluctuate within a 24-hour periodicity, but they will fluctuate based on seasonal periodicities as well. So in the winter, for example, oftentimes, especially in the more northern or southern latitudes, the farther away from the equator that you go, the daylight and the nighttime are going to have extended periods of time. For example, if you're up in Alaska during the summer, you're going to have light time most of the time, and this is going to alter how your circadian rhythm functions. If you're there during the winter time, you're going to have very limited daylight, and this will also alter your circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms then are adjusted or entrained. So you'll see this phrase a lot when you're talking about circadian rhythms. This is indicating that the circadian rhythm can be adjusted by environmental or external cues, and these environmental or external cues are called Zeitgebers. And this is a German word that means time giver or synchronizer. So any Zeitgeber is going to have an effect on regulating the circadian rhythm for that function. So the most common and most important Zeitgeber is going to be daylight. So light, physical activity, meals, social contact, and other external inputs into a person's system can cause shifts or changes or adjustments to the circadian rhythm. So animals typically generate endogenous 24-hour cycles of wakefulness and sleep based on our day length on the earth. Some animals also generate endogenous circannual rhythms. And so again, these are seasonal effects depending on how the seasons vary within the region that the animal is actually located in. So these can operate on an annual or yearly cycle or on a seasonal cycle as well. So migratory patterns in birds, animals storing food for the winter, these would be examples of rhythmic or cyclic patterns that occur within the animal's lifestyle. So there are biological effects that can happen on this type of annual circuity as well. So you can have circadian rhythms that occur at the annual level. So you can have seasonal effects on coat color, for example. So in the Siberian hamster, during the spring and summertime, his coat color will become a nice brown color, and this would make him blend in with the natural surroundings. However, in the winter, the Siberian hamster turns pure white, where he would match the snow color or the snowfall that would be on the ground. And so this is a seasonal effect, and it's likely caused by the alteration in day length that would cause his coat color to change. So this is actually quite striking. You can see a lot of these types of seasonal effects as well on other biological systems. So if you're looking at the gonad size or the testicular size of the male hamsters, you can see that they have a huge range. In the springtime, they become very large, up to 3 grams in size. And during the winter time, they shrink way down to about 0.5 grams, so that they're only active during the breeding season when the babies would then be viable. And so you have to wait for good weather to happen so that these guys can mate and become sexually active. When they're experiencing weather that is not conducive for rearing offspring, their testicles actually shrink. So they don't, if you don't use it, you lose it. Kind of adage here is taking place. And you can see during the winter time, when you have this shrinkage, there is a compound that becomes produced. This is called melatonin. Melatonin in this case is acting as a hormonal regulator. It's a small amino acid derived either hormone or neurotransmitter, depending upon where it's secreted within the body. So it can be secreted as a neurotransmitter, but it also can be secreted as a hormone and have hormonal effects within the organism as well. So in this case, the melatonin secretion correlates very well with the testicular size. When you have reduced melatonin being expressed, you have an increased growth in the gonadal size. If you have a lot of melatonin present, which you would have during the winter time, when the darker hours are more prevalent, it's going to cause the secretion of higher levels of melatonin. This causes the gonads in this hamster to actually shrink. So this is quite striking. So these circadian rhythms that actually work in a 24-hour cycle are going to help regulate the sleep-wake cycle. They can also regulate things like the frequency of eating and drinking, body temperature, the secretion of many hormones, the volume of urination, our sensitivity to drugs, can all be regulated by these circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms actually are going to play an important role when we start thinking about our overall health patterns. So sleep is actually a very restorative condition that's going to help make us healthier by helping restore the immune system and providing time to consolidate memory and learning function that's gone on during the day. And it also provides a time that you can have regeneration and repair of systems within the body. So this is just an example of temperature, which is going to be altered in a circadian fashion as well. And so if you have hours from sleep onset, you can see that in the very early morning, you've got the lowest body temperatures, and then a peak actually is going to arise about 6 or 7 hours prior to going to sleep. So we'll go over a couple of terms for our biological rhythms and characteristics. So the amplitude is going to be the magnitude of change in the activity. So how much is it fluctuating during a cycle? The actual period is going to be the time that it takes to complete the entire cycle. And so in this case, they're measuring from peak to peak. You could also measure from trough to get the period time. Wherever you see a repeating unit, you could even start from the middle and go all the way through to the next middle and do a full entire cycle to reach the other side. And then the phase is going to be at any recognizable part of the cycle. In this case, you're looking at the part of the cycle that has the absolute lowest levels of this reactive component. So this would be an active phase of this cycle. So these are just some terms that are frequently used to describe wave functionalities that have repeating cycles associated with them. So typically circadian rhythms are going to remain pretty constant despite any lack of environmental cues that indicate the time of day. They can differ between people, and they can lead to different patterns of wakefulness and alertness. So it appears that some people need more sleep than other people, and this is likely due to the fact that their wiring is just a little bit different, and they each have a little bit different selectivity when it comes to their natural circadian rhythms. They can also change during our lifetime, so they can change as a function of age. So oftentimes sleep patterns from childhood to late adulthood are going to change. I know I see this readily for my daughter. When she was very little, she hardly liked to sleep at all. I mean, she could stay up very late and get up very early, and that was just her natural sleep pattern. And we would try to put her down earlier, but she just would not fall asleep until about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. And then she was back up by about 5 in the morning. So this changed when she got into high school, and now she could probably sleep till noon. So this has been an interesting change to see as my daughter has grown, and I've noticed similar changes in myself as well. So when people are doing experiments to actually test and look at the periodicity of the circadian rhythms, they actually will place the subjects that they're studying in environments that have no clues as to the time of day. So they're not allowing them to look at the clock or watch TV or do any of these normal things that would help you what time of day it is. So they only have external environmental cues like sunlight to help them out with their circadian rhythms. So the results actually are very dependent on the amount of light to which the subjects are artificially exposed. So our interpretation of the light within our environment has a dramatic effect on how our circadian rhythm and our balance for many of our hormones is going to take place. So interestingly, you can alter people's circadian rhythms by altering the amount of light that they're exposed to. So circadian rhythms tend to run faster in bright light conditions. Subjects have trouble sleeping, wake up earlier, but if they're held in constant darkness, people have more difficulty waking, and they can stay asleep much longer time periods. So within humans, the circadian clock generates a rhythm slightly longer than 24 hours when there's no external cue that's set to it. So people can adjust to between 23 to a 25-hour day, but they don't adjust so well if you dramatically change the hours to 22 or 28-hour day. And also interestingly, bright light late in the day can lengthen the circadian rhythm, can make you stay up later. So how are these mechanisms of circadian rhythms actually controlled? So we're going to take a look at the brain. Surprise, surprise, we've been looking a lot at the brain. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is a series of neuronal cells that are bundled together that play a major role in activating the circadian rhythm pathways. And specifically, they will activate the pineal gland, which will go on to secrete melatonin. And so the structure of melatonin, since it's one of the major players that's going to be involved in regulating circadian rhythms, is actually shown here. It's a tryptophan derivative, and so tryptophan levels are pretty high in turkey, and so oftentimes people say they get sleepy after they eat turkey, and they liken it to having high levels of tryptophan. It's thought that tryptophan will lead to an increase in melatonin levels after you've eaten your Thanksgiving turkey. Interestingly, products containing melatonin have been available over the counter in the United States since the mid-1990s. So this is a dietary supplement that people can take. However, in many other countries, the sale of this neurohormone is actually not permitted, or it requires a prescription. So different countries have different ways of actually handling this compound. It does act as a neurotransmitter, and it also acts as a hormone when it becomes secreted by the pineal gland. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is part of the hypothalamus, and it's also the main control center of the circadian rhythms of sleep and temperature. So this is pretty interesting because we've just spent a lot of time talking about stress. And we saw that the hypothalamus is actually very integral in a lot of hormonal processes. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are very key components of the connection between the brain and the body. So the brain talking to the body will often happen between this system. And so there's a lot of hormones, neurohormones, that are secreted by the hypothalamus that are going to affect the pituitary gland. And in this case, they're also going to affect the pineal gland, which we will see the location of here in a couple of slides. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus is located above the optic chiasm, and we'll take a look at this positioning as well. And it has an instantaneous feed into the SCN region from the optic nerve. And so damage to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN, typically results in less consistent body rhythms that are no longer synchronized to the environmental patterns of light and darkness. And this is not an all or nothing. The SCN nucleus is very involved in this process, but it's not the only system that's involved. So other neural pathways can help pick up the plasticity of this region if this region becomes damaged. So if we look at the brain, the hypothalamus is located here, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus is located right here at the edge. The optic chiasm is going to be coming in from here, so you've got your eyes would be over here. The optic nerve is going to send impulses or input as the eyes are exposed to light levels into this region of the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So the pituitary gland is pretty close over here as well. And looking down maybe right here be the pituitary gland. So remember, the hypothalamus will dump a lot of stuff right onto the pituitary. It also has some effect over here at the pineal gland. Okay, in the next few following slides are just going to summarize the path that the signaling actually goes through to innervate and to activate this system. So you've got the activation of the suprachiasmatic neurons in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to actually run through the spinal cord and then back up through the superior cervical ganglion. And this is actually going to mediate the effects on the pineal gland to cause the release of melatonin. So in the total darkness, as long as you have this complete circuit present, you're going to get activation of the pineal gland to cause the expression of the melatonin. And that's what you see here on this next slide. You see the actual darkness curve. So for the time period extending from about midnight all the way till 10 a.m., you can see that there is the circadian rhythm of the increase in melatonin secretion, and this is due to secretion from the pineal gland that's located back here. If you have a light pulse that you expose somebody to, so that's what is shown in this diagram, the light is being pulsed on here, you actually reset the situation. So if they receive this light pulse at 2 a.m., then you're going to have a reset of the melatonin pulse, and you're going to reset your circadian rhythm, and it's going to block expression prematurely of the melatonin release from the pineal gland when you have that bright light exposure during a sleep period. So if you wake up in the middle of the night, like my husband and I did the past weekend, our snake actually got out of the tank. It was bumping things within our room, and so we kept hearing it move around in our room, and we didn't know where it was. So finally there was a big thud, and we both woke up and were like startled, and we turned on the light. We got this bright pulse of light, and we found our snake sitting on the bookshelf, and he'd knocked one of our pictures off. So we captured our snake, put him back in his tank, and went back to bed. But I'm sure that our melatonin signature looked somewhat like this that night. So another interesting feature is that the signaling goes from the optical retina through the suprachiasmatic neurons that are located in the hypothalamus, and then it has to come down here and link through the spinal cord and through the superior cervical ganglion to reach the pineal gland. If you have the signaling, if it's severed in any way, so if you have a tetraplegic, for example, and you can't complete the signaling pathway, they will have a dysregulation of the melatonin system. So tetraplegics are fully incapacitated to produce the normal melatonin signaling that creates the circadian rhythm. And the paraplegics are partially affected as well. So if we look at normal melatonin signaling, again, you can see in a control patient that is not damaged in any way, normal melatonin signaling is going to look like this. It's going to have the highest expression in the middle of the night, so somewhere between midnight and 8 a.m. You would have peak melatonin expression, and this can vary again between individuals depending on their normal circadian pattern. And cortisol is also controlled in this kind of fashion as well. You've got peak levels rising so that they are peak early in the morning, and cortisol levels will normally decline within individuals over the rest of the day until they reach their low point at about midnight. So this would be a normal cortisol pattern that you would see in an individual as well. So if you actually look at paraplegic patients, which are shown in these two diagrams here and these two diagrams here, you can see that their overall patterns for cortisol secretion are largely unaltered. They still have pretty good cortisol response within the body, and they show some periodicity, although this periodicity can be somewhat altered and irregular. So it's not completely controlled on the circadian rhythm within paraplegics or in tetraplegics, although you do have the circadian cycling still going on with the cortisol. However, if you look at melatonin in the paraplegic individual, the melatonin secretion is dramatically reduced in paraplegic patients, and it's completely obliterated in tetraplegic patients, showing that the suprachiasmatic nucleus has to activate the superior cervical ganglion and then lead to the pineal gland to control the expression of melatonin within the person. So what happens if there's damage to the suprachiasmatic nucleus? This has also been shown in different mammals. So if you take a hamster and you remove that body of neurons, you start getting arrhythmic patterns of locomotion, feeding, and hormone secretion. So the circadian rhythms within this organism are largely disrupted by removal of the SCN neurons. If you implant new SCN tissue into the hamster, you can actually restore the rhythms from the donor hamster. So this is just showing the importance of the suprachiasmatic nucleus to many of the circadian processes. However, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is not the only center that regulates circadian rhythms. So if you ablate the SCN in rhesus monkey, for example, so you have some loss of the activity cycle, you may alter rhythms that are going to control feeding, locomotion, and some of the hormone secretion, but it's not the only pacemaker. So if you actually will maintain your temperature cycle even if you ablate the SCN nucleus. If you ablate the ventromedial hypothalamus, however, you also lose the body temperature cycle that's seen in the circadian rhythms. So there's multiple areas within the brain that are involved in circadian rhythm. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is going to play an important role. So interestingly, the SCN is genetically controlled as well, and it will independently generate the circadian rhythm without external inputs. So like blind people, for example, still have circadian rhythms that are going to happen even if they don't have that input of light that's coming through the optic nerve. So if somebody has had optic nerve damage, they still will produce a circadian rhythm, but it will fluctuate a little bit from the normal 24-hour cycle. So if you actually take cells from the SCN and you raise them in tissue culture in vitro, so out of the body, they will actually continue to produce action potentials in a very rhythmic pattern. So they will still move on about a 25-hour day schedule, and so it'll be a little bit varied from the normal externally controlled environment where light patterns are going to be the main input to helping control circadian rhythm. So what this suggests is that there's various cells in the body that help communicate with each other to sharpen the circadian rhythm. So there's two types of genes that are responsible for generating the circadian rhythm, and these are called the period gene and the timeless gene. And the proteins that they produce are called PER and TIM for short. So the PER and the TIM proteins are going to increase the activity of certain kind of neurons in the suprachiasmatic center that is going to help regulate sleep and waking cycles. And so mutations then in the PER gene actually result in odd circadian rhythms. So they deregulate the circadian rhythm. And so this just shows the expression of the TIM and the PER genes during a normal cycling day within the suprachiasmatic neurons. So you can see during wakefulness time during the day, you've got increasing levels of the PER and the TIM proteins to a maximum at about midnight when you have nightfall. And then this is going to be reduced during the nighttime or the darkness to the low point at waking. And then you will have a gradual increase again. If you disrupt somebody's sleep with the bright pulse of light, you can see that there's a dramatic shift in the levels of the TIM and the PER proteins. And so you can see that bright pulse of light is also causing the reset in the protein levels of the TIM and the PER proteins in the suprachiasmatic neurons. And so this is helping to cause the effect that is seen from the environmental cues or the Zeitgebers that are going to help affect or entrain the circadian rhythm. So this causes a phase advance. It's going to occur before it normally should. So the SCN is going to regulate waking and sleeping by helping control activity levels in other areas of the brain. So again, the SCN is regulating the pineal gland, which is an endocrine gland that's located posterior to the thalamus. So we've already seen where that's located in the brain. If we go back to our little picture. So if we take a quick look at the picture of the brain, you'll see the pineal gland is located here. Pituitary gland would be down here, and the hypothalamus located here. Again, that signaling pathway has to be routed down through the spinal cord, back up to the pineal gland. The pineal gland then is going to secrete melatonin, which is a hormone that's going to increase sleepiness within the person. So melatonin secretion usually begins 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. And melatonin then is going to feed back to help reset the biological clock through its effects on receptors in the SCN nucleus or center. So melatonin can actually affect the SCN neurons and downregulate their activity. So it's a negative feedback loop. So if you actually take melatonin, which you can purchase over the counter, if you take this in the afternoon, you can phase advance the internal clock. So you're going to shift it forward. So it can be used as a sleep aid. So if you're suffering from insomnia, for example, melatonin can help reset your internal clock and get you back on the correct circadian schedule. So the purpose of our circadian rhythm is to help keep our internal workings in phase with our outside world. It's a way that we can connect to our environment. And this is another key feature that we will see in traditional Chinese medicine. Chinese medicine really works on this premise of trying to connect with the environment and maintain balance and harmony within our bodies. And so really, when I think about traditional Chinese medicine, I think about circadian rhythms and that our connection to Western medicine and the circadian rhythm is what best represents our connection with traditional Chinese medicine, maintaining balance within the person. So light is very critical for the periodicity and for resetting our circadian rhythms. And so remember, the Zeitgebers is the name that's used to describe any stimulus that helps reset the circadian rhythms. And so light is the predominant Zeitgeber. Exercise, noise, meals, and temperature are other Zeitgebers that are going to help affect the circadian rhythms as well. So jet lag then would refer to the disruption of the circadian rhythm when you cross time zones and you alter your day-night cycling. So it's going to stem from having a mismatch of your internal circadian clock and the external time. So Typically, this is going to be characterized by sleepiness during the day, sleeplessness at night, and then impaired concentration during the day when you feel like you should be asleep. So if you travel west, you would experience phase delays in the circadian rhythm. Traveling east, you experience phase advances for our circadian rhythms. So if you're traveling east, from west to east, the time zone is going to be later, so you're going to think that it's earlier than it actually is. And so if you arrive in London, for example, at 7 a.m., your body still feels like it's 2 a.m. if you are flying from New York. So you're going to be sleepy when you get to London, and you have to stay awake all day because you should feel like you should be in the middle of the night and sleeping. So this will cause you to experience the jet lag. So light does help to reset the suprachiasmatic neurons, and it happens via a small branch of the optic nerve that's known as the retino-hypothalamic path. So it travels directly from the retina to the SCN nucleus. And this retino-hypothalamic path comes from a very special population of ganglion cells that have their own photopigment that's called melanopsin. And so these cells respond directly to light input, and they do not require any input from the rods or the cone cells that actually help us see structure and get interpreted in our visual acuity. So the light emission that's activating the circadian rhythms is controlled by an entirely separate set of cells than the light system that is being interpreted for our visual acuity in our visual system.